Hi all, welcome to another episode in the Leading Safely podcast. Today, the special guest you will hear me chatting with is Alena Titterton, who is a partner at Clyde & Co. Alena is a passionate health and safety security specialist who is motivated to work collaboratively with clients to develop practical solutions that deliver safe outcomes. Her practice includes designing and implementing safety due diligence frameworks for officers, safety management systems, positive safety performance reporting systems, conducting legal gap analyses for compliance against WHS laws, conducting safety investigations, defending prosecutions, and conducting peer benching studies for organisations looking to make step change to be leaders in safety. I'm talking to Alena today because today marks the second week of Safe Work Month. And this week's theme from Safe Work Australia is managing work health and safety risks and preventing harm. Alena's topic of choice is right up the alley of this exact theme and is something that, whilst may seem controversial and definitely requires a mindset change from top level down, would and could revolutionise safety reporting if adopted. So let's get into this juicy call with Alena. So hi Alena, thanks for taking time out of your super busy day to chat with me, and I'm looking forward to chatting more about the Due Diligence Standard, which is set to change the way that organisations measure HSE for the better. As you know, I've been asking all of my special guests those three general questions because I'm curious when it comes to things like magical solutions, which I've heard you've got a good one for us. So let's get into those juicy questions, shall we? So first one up, what do you think makes an effective leader when it comes to health and safety?
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Georgina. I just wanted to say that first. I really appreciate it. I love a good chat about safety, anytime, anywhere. So what makes a really effective leader on health and safety? I think the great thing in leaders that I see who are awesome from a safety perspective is that they're curious and they listen to their people. They're asking, do their people actually have what they need to perform their work successfully? And are there any barriers to performing work safely and successfully? And they're curious about what the answers are, and they're following through on whatever they learn. So people are seeing that it's real for them. And the other thing I see from great safety leaders is that they celebrate success. And they're not just celebrating success on safety in their own organisation, but they're also celebrating success when they see it in their peers as well. So I think of someone like Alison Mirams, who has done amazing work as a CEO in terms of trying to change the construction industry culture and 6-day working weeks to 5 days and getting it down and sort of pilot testing that. And she kind of led from the front and had a lot of criticism, but has been able to be successful in those pilots, and then other people doing it as well. And then she shouts out the success of those others who are following her as well. So that's how you kind of build a network of like-minded people, and you kind of be traveling together in the right direction for improving everyone's lives.
Mm-hmm. And it's always good, I guess, from a safety perspective to have a community, behind you as well, and to do call out those successes. And I guess the other aspect is if someone isn't necessarily, on that journey, but perhaps coaching them and, taking them with you if you can, bringing them along.
Exactly.
So that's great. What would be your words of wisdom for someone dealing with people who don't want to change when it comes to health and safety? And this, I'm curious because of your legal background. You've seen what happens when they don't come along the journey. So what's your advice?
Oh, look, this is difficult. I was thinking about this, and I remember I had an epiphany at the end of a university exam a very, very long time ago now. But I was studying not only law, but also psychology. And I was sitting at the end of this psychology exam, and I just had this epiphany. And I was like, wow, your success in life has a lot to do with your capacity to adapt. And the number of times I've reflected and remembered that moment because seeing people kind of sticking to what they've always thought and being stuck really gets in the way of progress. And you have to keep learning, and you have to learn from what goes right as well as what goes wrong. And I think if the question is asking for change from safety professionals, It's so important for safety professionals to keep learning. We're always talking to our businesses about continuous improvement, right?
Yeah.
But that continuous improvement shouldn't be just for everybody else. It's got to be for us too. So if what we've been doing in trying to lead to better safety outcomes isn't working, isn't it time to try a different approach? Maybe test something else? Because we keep having safety incidents, we keep having fatalities, so we need to do something different perhaps. So I would, pause before you're digging in to what you've always done.
It's true. And what about if you could invent something to solve a health and safety issue in the workplace where expenditure and opinions and all that stuff that comes with it didn't matter? What would you do and why?
Oh, this is tough because I just have so many ideas. And how do you boil it down to one? I really wish I could invent the integration cure. Having safety be embedded completely in operational practices no matter what your discipline is. So that's everyone being actively engaged with the role that they have to play for safe outcomes, and how to get that truly multidisciplinary approach so that all decision making is supporting safe outcomes, whether that's senior leadership, whether it's the finance area of an organisation, the procurement area, the operational business units, the site management, the supervisors, the frontline workers, all of that. And then sort of further to that point, as I kind of thought a bit more deeply about your question, I'm quite passionate about influencing the removal of structural institutional barriers to change that have massive flow-on effects for health and safety outcomes down the line. And what I've found working in this area for 15, 20 years now is that so much is embedded in the assumptions of the design of what we just accept about how things work. So if I give you some examples, the way the legal system's structured such that it disproportionately criminalises and penalises Indigenous Australians. So we see overrepresentation of Indigenous Australians in custody, and then a completely unacceptable level of Indigenous deaths in custody. And we've had countless coronial inquests that have told us about the structural issues that need to be fixed, and we still don't learn and rectify those structural issues. So that's one example. We still have so many young children dying on Australian farms because we like to romanticise the idea of growing up in that type of environment instead of seeing it as the extraordinarily hazardous working environment that it is. And then the third example that comes to mind is professional services. So professional services are nearly all based on time-based billing in the main, and that has massive flow-on effects, particularly for, I think, the potential for incentivising unsafe work practices because you're selling hours rather than outcomes. And that has flow-on effects in terms of increasing psychosocial hazards and risks when it comes to stress, fatigue and burnout. So if I could do anything, it would be inventing the removal of structural institutional barriers to safety.
There's two things actually, Alena. That's not one thing. Your huge. First one was
huge.
like,
I would do so much.
It's huge. It is very big, and I like your second one is very humane, and they're very huge things that are happening at the moment and have continued to occur over time. And you're right, nothing changes. And the first aspect that you explained is literally my dream. Like for it to be business as usual, for there to be no safety professionals, because every single person and every level of the organisation has safety as part of their normal everyday practice. And you don't need someone to stand at pre-start, and you don't need someone to come and hold your hand to do whatever it is you need to do, because the right thing to do is be safe and do what's required. So
it's just integrated and you're empowered 100%. To do your work in that way.
That's right. And you've got the skills and the tools and the resources are provided for you, I guess, is that backup to that. But giving me chills just talking about it. Perfect. So then obviously, you get to speak about a topic that you're very passionate about. What is it you're going to share with our listeners today?
Well, it's sharing one aspect of how we're trying to change the conversation, I guess, which is changing it at the sort of top level and getting boards and senior leadership teams to be focusing on the right things instead of the challenge we've had for so long, which is boards and senior leadership teams being quite focused on how they assess performance based on lag indicators, and in particular lost time injuries, lost time injury frequency rates, and total recordable injury frequency rate as well. So that's been the traditional metrics that boards have used everywhere to benchmark themselves, assess their own performance. But we all know that those traditional metrics have problems. And the question is, well, what would we do instead? And so the conversation in safety circles for a really long time has been, well, there's no alternatives. We're stuck with this world. That's all there is. And a few of us kind of got together and went, well, is that really right? Maybe we just haven't tried hard enough to try to solve the problem of what might an alternative actually look like. So, and this particular group of people that kind of banded together to try to solve the unsolvable problem all started when a global mining company asked a few of us, Michael Toomer from Clyde & Co, myself, along with Professor Sydney Decker and Kelvin Gann at Art of Work. They asked us to write a paper for the International Council of Mining and Minerals and present to them on whether there are any legal obligations that require companies to use TRIFR as a health and safety performance measure. And then they asked us to talk about the problems of TRIFR as a performance measure so that there could be that conversation at ICMM. Now, for those of you who haven't read the myriad reports on the problems with TRIFR, it's worth just summarising quickly so you understand the context of why we've done this due diligence index for safety. But TRIFR is a rate measure that doesn't take severity into account. You have a lower TRIFR, you may actually have a higher probability of a fatality, so those metrics don't predict the risk of catastrophic incidents. You're not always comparing apples with apples either. So some organisations will include contractors in their numbers, but others will only include employees, for example. And lag metrics like this can be and are often manipulated, and sadly even more so when they're linked into performance incentive schemes. And indeed, interestingly enough, TRIFR may actually cause legal liability risks, and this is something less well known, I think. There have been some fraud cases in the US that have seen safety managers go to jail where TRIFR data had been manipulated to obtain financial advantage in US government contracts, for example. So there's numerous problems with those traditional metrics. So what's the alternative? And we hadn't answered that question for 20, 30 years of having this conversation on lag metrics. And we need to try to do something different. So we know that boards want a way to understand, assess and monitor health and safety performance. They always want a way to benchmark themselves against their peers. And so after that presentation, we set about pulling together a group of collaborators who work in industry, work in academia, and in consulting, and ourselves as a law firm to look at what that alternative might look like for what we could give boards. And what we now have, 3.5, 4 years later, that's how long we've been trying to cook this thing. We have the launch of the first version of the Due Diligence Index for Safety. And it really is the start of an attempt at an alternative metric for boards and senior executives to use for health and safety performance measurement. And it's designed on the idea of measuring safety capacity, but it's also mapped to the personal legal obligations that those senior leaders have, which is this duty to exercise due diligence to ensure that the organisation for which they are officers is meeting its duties under the laws. So you can download the standard for free. It's freely available. Everyone can access it. And I'm sure you have the capacity to give people links, etc. But it's www.duediligenceindex.online if you want to go grab it. It's open source and it's overseen by a not-for-profit association called the Due Diligence Index Council. And what the Due Diligence Index Council is looking to create is a bit of a community of practice of people who are using the DDIS and sharing lessons so that can then inform updating the standard through the sharing of lessons on its use over time. So we're not saying this is the perfect end-all solution and it's never going to change and it's completely set in stone. We want people to be using it, giving feedback so that we can continuously improve it over time as well. So I think we launched it about 3 weeks ago now, and over 500 people have downloaded the standard. We've had regulators and companies globally looking at it. Lots of requests for it to be translated into many different languages, which is very exciting. And I think it's ridiculous. I just checked before dialing in to chat with you, Georgina. Over 11,000 people have viewed the live stream of our launch function, which is incredible. So it's nice to see that it's getting so much interest and people are really curious about learning about it, which is great. So members of the original pilot group who tested it before we launched it, they're also on the board of the council, and that original pilot group included safety professionals across multiple industries, which I think is really important because we were trying to see how this would work for different kinds of industry contexts. So construction, logistics, aviation, electrical distribution, and global contracted services organisations were all involved. So really different industry, and you learn a lot through that sharing of information of how it was working in different types of environments. So that pilot testing process was really quite rigorous to get to the point of the version of the standard we have now. So I can tell you a little bit about the standard if you want me to kind of talk about that.
That'd be great. Yeah, that's great.
So yeah, we've developed this standard and this index to provide a metric for boards and executives to understand the presence of safety in their organisation. So we wanted to create a number for boards, but we wanted that number to be meaningful. So we knew that we couldn't replace the single TRIFR number with something that wasn't a number if we were ever going to get traction with boards. Like I spend my life talking to boards about how to do safety leadership and due diligence effectively. So I know what those conversations in boardrooms looks like. They really want to compare that number against their peer. And so we knew if we just created something qualitative and not quantitative, it was just never going to get traction in the boardrooms. That's just a reality. But we don't want to do numbers for numbers' sake. We don't just want to be counting things. That's not meaningful, right? We wanted to actually grapple with the question of what would be a meaningful number. How do we create that meaningful number for people? So the standard that you can download helps organisations with understanding and implementing the metric. And the standard starts by providing an overview of what we're trying to do here, the philosophy that's informing it. We talk about the legislative framework around officers being expected to undertake due diligence, and we talk about the 6 elements that make up officer due diligence. And what the DDI metric does is it maps to those 6 elements of officer due diligence with 6 KPIs for each one of those elements. So for those who aren't familiar with due diligence under the legislation, it's got those 6 elements of firstly, acquiring knowledge, secondly, gaining an understanding of operations, hazards, risks, thirdly, resourcing risk management, fourthly, monitoring health and safety performance, fifthly, ensuring legal compliance, and finally, attentive verification of the resources and processes. So that's the 6 elements of due diligence, and each KPI maps quite neatly to what that expectation set is. So we then adopt a kind of consistent structure throughout the standard. So for each due diligence element, there's that key performance indicator that's been developed and assigned. And then we set out for you, what the due diligence element is, the purpose of the element, the KPI measure itself, how that KPI measure actually links to that element of due diligence. So we explain the rationale for how and why we got to where we get to. And then we provide guidance in terms of some core definitions relevant to that KPI so that everyone can have a shared understanding of the concepts that we're talking about and can apply them consistently. Because part of the design is very much to make sure that we're developing an index that can enable comparisons between organisations on health and safety capacity and its assurance. So then we set out the methodology of data collection and the calculations required for each metric, and then finally give some guidance on how you would go about reporting against each KPI. So there's actually the guidance for the qualitative reporting that should come alongside each one of those data numbers as well. It's not just numbers for numbers' sake. So what are those 6 KPIs against those elements? The first KPI is worker insight experience feedback weighting by percentage of worker insights effectively closed out per million hours worked. And we have a definition of what worker insights is, so we get a consistent approach. But we're talking about effective closeout of worker insights identified. So it's not just counting the number of insight activities, because that wouldn't be meaningful, right? It's what did we learn, and have we actually applied what we've learned? That's what we're trying to get at. And for me, this is a bit nerdy, for me, one of the coolest aspects of the design of the DDIS guide, because I really do think it's cool, is the fact that we've built in this worker experience feedback weighting into the metrics. So it's very difficult to manipulate the data when you've got that built-in feedback loop, requiring that people are qualitatively finding the experience of the worker insight useful. And you're literally asking every single person that question. Yeah. So we've got a sort of Uber star rating system for that.
Sorry, Alena, I like that sometimes the wording changes depending on who you're speaking to as well. It kind of makes it identifiable, but it also kind of shapes it in the way that you can get that really good data as well back. Like if you're speaking to a leader, you'll ask this, but if you're speaking to a worker, not that a leader's not a worker, but obviously if you're speaking to the worker, then the wording is a little bit different, and then that can change things slightly. So I like completely. That it's written like that.
And that's right, because we've got that worker feedback piece, and then you've got the leader feedback piece, right? So, and as you say, the worker question is very much like, did you feel heard in that interaction? Yeah. And the leader question is, did I gain a useful insight?
Yeah.
Through that
and both of those are fantastic bits of data, both in their own kind of sphere as well for you. So, yeah, I'm a convert. You don't need to tell me. Yeah.
Exactly. And what's super interesting is that having that data on those questions enables you to have more curious conversations.
Yeah.
And there's a number of ways in which that's sort of built into the metrics in the DDIS, because we do a very similar thing for element 2 when we're looking at the metric there is learning team experience feedback weighting by the number of working hours invested in learning teams per million hours worked. And so we've got that feedback weighting question about how valuable that experience was again there. So it's built in multiple ways throughout. So you've got a number of different data sets that will enable you to ask better questions. And on element 3, in determining the resourcing piece, we're doing surveys of different sort of areas in the business, the frontline experience, the supervisor experience, the leader experience, the SME, the safety professional experience, of whether they think there are sufficient resources for safe, successful outcomes, and we break it down into particular types of questions that go to those points that are relevant to resourcing, health and safety capacity. So it's looking at materials. Do you have the materials you need, your procedures you need, the work methods you need, supervision and management support that you need, communication, training, skills. And then we're also asking those really challenging questions around work demands and constraints and conflict of goals and those sorts of things as well. And all of those instruments really give you a lot of opportunity for learning. And the perception differences between those different cohorts.
Yeah.
So it may not be that you don't have the resources. It may be a communication issue and a perception issue that you've got to deal with. But if you're not asking the right types of questions, you're never going to know what the interventions need to be, right? So it's driving you to just better capacity to know what's going on so that you can have better decision making. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a little bit less difficult to manipulate, given so many different ways of getting that feedback through.
Yeah, no, that's perfect.
I've probably only done about half of the metrics themselves, but element 4 kind of talks about incident response, essentially, how you're actually considering information regarding incidents, hazards and risks, and responding to that. So what that requires is a resourcing of investigation processes. So that's why the KPI for element 4 goes to the reporting on the number of learning reviews and learning team investigations per million hours worked. And learning reviews is about the investigation of incidents. So it's making sure that you're doing that right. Element 5 is all about ensuring legal compliance. So we've translated that into a metric that assesses the percentage of legal compliance corrective actions closed out. So, to that point of, collecting the number of things, well, if we were just to make a metric that said ensuring legal compliance, that you have done a legal compliance audit, tick, well, that's not actually what's required for legal compliance. It's understanding what the gaps were and making sure that you've closed them out, right? So that's why that metric is that. And then element 6 is a verification element. So there's another one of those feedback loops built in with this KPI measure for element 6 as a safety net promoter score. So that's simply asking people to rate on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely is it that you'd recommend the way that health and safety is practiced in your organisation to a friend or workmate, and seeing what the results of that are. So each one of those metrics arrives at a score between 1 and 5, and then the total score for the DDIS is the average of those 6 elements. And there's Excel spreadsheets that have been developed to then populate some visual representations of those scores for board reporting as well. So that's the DDIS in a nutshell, or where it is now anyway, before the community practice takes it over.
I think it's awesome to, from a safety professional, boots on the ground type role, to be able to set a baseline as well. Even if your organisation isn't necessarily the most resilient and at the top of the maturity chain, at the end of the day, you could use it to set that baseline and create that task and action list for the organisation to get on board with learning teams. I mean, it's a huge action piece. I know, from an organisational standpoint, it might look like it's overwhelming, but having read through it kind of numerous times already, it's written in layman's terms. It's not written at academics. It's written for anyone, any safety professional at any level in their career to be able to pick up and, coach and mentor staff around it. But it also will set that baseline to get your organisation moving. And potentially, if you're a startup and you start with that, then you're already headed in the right direction. From the very time you set foot on the ground, you've got what you need to do laid out for you. Follow those steps, and you'll get to where you need to be. But for those organisations at the other end, there's quite a bit of, a big chunk of work in there, and that does need the right resourcing and the right, guidance, to get them going to where they need to be. So, yeah.
I think that's so right. I'm really glad you said that, because I'm always saying to people that, yes, where you're going to fit on this on day one depends on where you are in your safety culture maturity journey.
Yeah.
But I don't think that should stop you from starting to use it, because I think it helps you get on the journey. And it's about building capacity over time, right? So as long as you're seeing improvement as you bring some of these concepts online, whether it's worker insights or learning teams or learning investigations, you are learning more about how work is actually being performed and what are the barriers to successful work. And that is only a good thing.
Oh, correct. And you're increasing your consultative approach with your workforce as well, which, we all know has its own benefits in itself. So even if at the end of the day you went, okay, we've done all this work, it may not be our cup of tea, which hopefully nobody does. But if they do end up, you've still made improvements towards the right end of the scale. You haven't gone backwards, and you've brought your workers on board where they trust you. They feel like you had an input, there's more buy-in, there's all these positive things that from a safety perspective, they may not be on that scale, but from a personal perspective and from that buy-in and value and trust and the organisational, morale, when you go out to work, people are happier and more, that in itself is worth more than the document that you download from, the council and be part of this process. So I think it's benefits there.
It's helping you build engagement and trust. And we know that that's what we need for safe outcomes. How many times have we learnt that through the best practice research that's out there? And this is driving you in a good way towards that.
Yeah. So, it's very exciting. And it's so great that, the organisations that were involved and yourself and all the hard work that kind of went into it have got this first draft, final draft, final good to go. However, I'm sure there's going to be adaptations, first, second, maybe a gazillion editions coming out as things change. And the pilot, did you have any feedback from the pilot organisations that did trial it? Like, was there anything that kind of stood out to you that needed to be tweaked majorly at all?
Yeah, I mean, they really were fantastic. And it's a good moment to say, like, thank you so much to all of those people who said, you know what, we want to be part of trying to do something differently, because they were really early adopters, 4 years ago. And, those organisations put down some money to help with developing something, and they gave so much of their time to piloting what we were doing and being part of so many different workshops. So I have so much time for the people who are, and they're all listed in the front of the standard.
Yep.
So much time for all of them, because they're amazing early adopters and getting this out there. But what was really interesting about the workshop process is that they really challenged us to make sure we weren't just counting things, and it wasn't just the busy work that safety can become, instead of being about real things. So, an early iteration on element 5 KPI did have, number of legal compliance audits completed, instead of it being about the percentage of corrective actions closed out courtesy of the legal compliance audits. And that feedback coming from them going, no, we're not going to count a thing, like let's make sure that we're doing something meaningful, really made that metric into what it is. So yeah, the pilot process was so important to get us to the point that we have something that we feel like we can put out there in the world at large.
No, that's awesome. And that's good to hear that you had all that kind of input and feedback, and you also had buy-in and that consultative approach from a variety of industries, which is great to know for our listeners who are, in an obscure industry that you may think, well, how would this apply to me? Obviously, there's been quite a few. And yeah, it isn't the forward of the document tells you who contributed, and it's a wide variety of organisations. So it's great to see. So that obviously is the conclusion of our time together, Alena. Thanks again for popping in and for sharing your time with me and chatting with us about the due diligence standard. Hopefully all of our listeners got something from it. So enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks so much, Georgina. This was fun.
Well then, what did you all think about Alena and the new due diligence standard? If you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend you sign up and download a copy. Even if your organisation's safety journey maturity-wise isn't where it needs to be to join in on the movement of no longer reporting on old school data like TRIFR and LTIFR, the document is a new way of thinking and provides you with some new processes which your organisation may not have even heard of before, like insights or learning teams. The document is very different, however these processes aren't. They're simple, easy to use, and will at least help get your organisation moving in the right direction when it comes to health and safety. Now, don't get me wrong, what you read may seem overwhelming, but we, and when I say we, I mean the organisation that I work for, Lydia Group, can actually help in this area, as I have developed an assessment tool that maps to the due diligence standard and helps identify where your organisation sits in regards to the identified elements in the standard. That way, your organisation can identify if there are any gaps and put together an action plan to fill those gaps. The tool I have created ideally should be facilitated by myself or a member of my team, and we would then partner with you to develop a realistic action plan, providing the right expertise to get the job done. However, we're also happy for the tool to be shared and utilised for self-assessment. After all, it is for the greater good of worker health and safety. So if you're interested in our due diligence standard assessment tool, or if you have feedback, comments, etc., please feel free to contact me directly via LinkedIn or by emailing leadingsafely@outlook.com. Until next time, stay safe.